The portal opens. Zeland reveals the slide you can only use when the mind falls asleep. If the real breakthrough happens only when the mind sleeps, then who is manifesting when you think you are awake? This question is not philosophical curiosity. It is the dividing line between forcing reality with the wrong part of yourself and finally accessing the mechanism that responds instantly, silently, and with precision. Today, you will see the exact point where Zeland says the conscious mind cannot follow. You will understand why every attempt to manifest while fully awake collapses under its own tension. You will recognize the biological window where your brain softens its resistance. You will discover the biblical principle that has described the same state for thousands of years. And you will understand why the slide only works when the mind releases control and another intelligence takes the lead. If you stay with me until the end, you will learn the real state where intention becomes weightless. The state where the inner image stops being effort and becomes nature. You will understand the exact physiological moment when the field opens and why this moment is the only one that matters. You will finally see why Zeland insists that what you do awake has little power compared to what you plant in the fading space between consciousness and sleep. If you skip this, you will keep using willpower against a mechanism that does not answer to effort. You will continue sending commands from the part of your mind that never creates. You will repeat the same invisible errors that sabotage your visualization from the inside. And you will keep ignoring the only doorway the field consistently responds to. Chapter 1. The Myth of Thinking While Awake. The greatest misunderstanding in manifestation begins with a simple assumption that the conscious mind is the commander. People sit upright, fully alert, trying to think their way into a new reality. They repeat phrases, they build images, they push emotions as if intensity alone could bend the field. Yet everything done in this state carries the same flaw. It is constructed from effort, and effort is the signature of resistance. Zeland dismantles this belief at its root. He shows that the mind in its awake state does not create. It analyzes, compares, defends, predicts, and rehearses danger. It imitates intention, but it never embodies it. What you call desire is often the ego trying to control an outcome it does not trust will happen naturally. That is why nothing shifts. The ego pretends to send a command, but the emotional field underneath it is transmitting tension, fear, urgency, and doubt. The field answers the deeper signal, not the rehearsed one. Neuroscience confirms this through studies on limbic override, showing that conscious thought is easily overridden by emotional coding stored far below awareness. Biblical language describes this as the divided heart, the state where the lips speak one thing while the inner man believes another. When these two parts contradict each other, the request dissolves before it ever reaches the level of influence. This is why the awake mind fails repeatedly. It cannot hide its internal conflict. It broadcasts effort, and effort signals lack. Every spiritual tradition, every mystical text, and every modern experiment point to the same conclusion. The awake mind is never the real sender. It is the commentator standing beside the true mechanism, believing it has control, while the deeper system ignores it completely. Chapter 2. The Secret Mechanism. The Transition State. There is a moment where the conscious mind loosens its grip. It is brief, fragile, and easily missed, yet it is the most powerful state a human being enters every single day. Zeland calls it the moment when the mind falls asleep, but consciousness remains present. Neuroscience calls it the hypnagogic window, the threshold between wakefulness and sleep, where the brain stops defending old narratives. In spiritual language, it is the place where inner truth becomes louder than external logic. This transition is not relaxation, it is not meditation, it is not imagination. It is a neurological shift that changes the entire chemistry of how reality is interpreted and transmitted. As the prefrontal cortex begins to deactivate, the mind's controlling functions fade. Analysis fades. Resistance fades. The ego's need to predict and protect fades. This creates a rare opening where impressions are no longer filtered through doubt. The brain becomes absorbent, receptive, and impressionable. The reticular activating system reduces its vigilance. The thalamus stops prioritizing external noise. The limbic system stops broadcasting old emotional signatures with the same force. In this space, the slide finally has room to imprint because the usual gates are not guarding the exit. You are no longer negotiating your intention with your past conditioning.
You are no longer performing desire, you are transmitting it from a deeper layer that does not question itself. The Bible describes the state symbolically through visions received on beds, through the phrase, "in the night watches," and through moments when prophets heard what they could not hear while awake. In every account, the message came when the conscious mind was quiet, not when it was striving. This alignment across Zeland, Scripture, and neuroscience points to the same truth. Creation responds only when the noise of the mind dissolves into the silence of transition. Chapter 3. The Bible, the Secret Room of Jesus. When Jesus spoke of entering the secret room and closing the door, he was not pointing to a physical location. He was describing a state of consciousness that mirrors precisely what Zeland calls the sleeping mind threshold. Matthew 6:6 is one of the most misunderstood instructions in all spiritual teachings. The command is simple: withdraw, shut out the external world, and meet the Father in the hidden place. Nothing about this instruction refers to words, petitions, or effort. It describes an inner shift where the ego is no longer the one speaking. The phrase, "close the door," is not about privacy. It is about neural quietness. It is about shutting the senses so the surface mind stops dominating the inner signal. When Jesus says, "Your Father who sees in secret," the language points directly to what neuroscience describes as the subconscious integration layer, the place where impressions bypass the analytical mind and influence the nervous system from within. Zeland's slide operates in this same terrain. It is not delivered outward, it is delivered inward, into the silent chamber the ego cannot enter. Every mystical passage in Scripture follows this logic. Samuel hears his name in the quiet. Elijah encounters the whisper, not the storm. Jacob receives revelation in the fading edge of sleep. Scripture repeatedly emphasizes that divine instruction or transformation occurs when the conscious mind is softened, quiet, and absent of noise. The secret room is the liminal field. It is the doorway between worlds. The same doorway Zeland insists must be entered before any slide has power. This is why Jesus never says to strive for belief. He never asks for intensity. He never valorizes effort. He speaks of stillness. He speaks of entering the inner chamber where the mind no longer interferes. He speaks of receiving, not forcing. Zeland's mechanism does not create a new theology. It reveals the scientific anatomy of what Scripture has always described. The slide is the modern language for the ancient secret room. Chapter 4. The ego falls asleep, consciousness wakes. There is a point where the ego loses its authority, not because you defeated it, but because the brain naturally changes states. As the mind drifts towards sleep, the ego's functions dissolve one by one. Its vigilance lowers, its narratives weaken, its control collapses. In this moment, a different intelligence rises, Not the analytical mind, but the deeper consciousness that observes without tension and receives without argument. This is the part of you the field actually listens to. It does not negotiate, it does not justify, it does not doubt. It simply transmits a state. The ego believes it is the true self because it speaks loudly during the day, but loudness has never been a sign of depth. When the ego becomes silent, you meet the layer that has been creating your reality long before you learn the word manifestation. This is the layer Zeland refers to when he says only the sleeping mind can open the slide. Neuroscience sees this shift in the decrease of beta waves and the rise of alpha-theta patterns. As the brain releases its grip on control, emotional signatures that once dominated your perception begin to weaken. Old stories lose their authority. Memories lose their intensity. The system stops replaying danger and begins responding to the present moment. This is the exact inner state where the slide becomes possible, because the body can finally accept a new identity without resistance. In spiritual terms, this is the moment when the old man becomes silent and the inner man takes precedence. Paul describes this as renewal. Mystics call it surrender. Zeland translates it into physics. All speak of the same turning point. Something in you that is not the ego steps forward when the ego steps back. Consciousness wakes when the mind sleeps, and only then does the field receive a clean signal. Chapter 5. How to enter the correct state without force. The transition into the slide is not created by technique. It is created by removing the obstacles that keep the mind awake while the deeper consciousness remains dormant. The first shift happens in the body, not through deep relaxation, but through a subtle interruption of your usual rhythm.
When you allow your breath to lose its pattern, even for a few seconds, the prefrontal cortex reduces its grip. The body interprets this as a signal that it no longer needs to maintain full alertness, and a window begins to open. There is also the phenomenon of micro-disattention. It occurs when your focus drifts for a moment and your awareness becomes softer, wider, less linear. This is not daydreaming. It is a neurological loosening. Studies on alpha-theta transitions show that when attention softens, the brain becomes more receptive to impression rather than analysis. This is the doorway you are looking for. It creates the internal space where the slide can imprint without being filtered by doubt. Another method is peripheral relaxation. Instead of trying to relax the entire body, which often becomes another form of effort, you shift attention to the edges of sensation. The limbs grow heavier. The boundaries become less defined. When the body feels less sharp, the ego becomes less sharp with it. This softening is a sign that the internal gatekeepers are stepping back. Then comes the anchor image. Not a visualization built through effort, but an impression that floats into awareness without being forced. When the mind is tired enough, this image appears with a different quality. It feels given rather than created. It does not require control. It does not demand intensity. Its presence is quiet, yet convincing. This quality marks it as a slide. Finally, there are the silent phrases that only work at the edge of sleep. They are not affirmations. They are reminders. Short, simple, declarative states delivered without emotion. When spoken internally in this liminal state, they bypass resistance because the mind is no longer arguing. What remains is a sense, almost physical, that the new identity fits. This sensation is the sign you have reached the correct state. It is subtle, but unmistakable. The body accepts before the mind comments. Chapter 6. The Slide, What It Really Is and What It Never Was. Most people mistake the slide for imagination. They think it is about building mental pictures with intensity, emotion, and detail. But everything constructed through effort carries the signature of the ego. It is fragile. It collapses as soon as the mind questions it. Zeland never described the slide as something crafted.
He described it as something received. A slide is not created. It arrives when the mind is quiet enough to let it emerge. This is why the slide is not visualization. Visualization depends on active mental engagement. The slide does not. Visualization requires concentration. The slide rejects it. Visualization produces emotional strain. The slide produces neutrality. When you visualize, you are trying to convince yourself. When the slide appears, you no longer need to convince anything. It feels natural, as if the image is a memory rather than a wish. It is also not imagination in the sense of making things up. Imagination is a tool of the awake mind. It builds scenarios. It constructs what feels possible. The slide bypasses the possible entirely. It presents a reality that feels familiar even if you have never lived it. That familiarity is the key. It is the inner recognition of a line of life you have already stepped into internally. The slide reveals it does not manufacture. Nor is the slide emotional intensity. Strong emotion belongs to the ego. It signals attachment, urgency, and craving. Zeland warns that importance kills intention. Studies on emotional regulation show that high arousal states activate networks of resistance, tightening the very patterns you are trying to override. A real slide carries no emotional spike. It has weight without pressure, presence without force. It is not meditation either. Meditation empties. The slide imprints. Meditation dissolves identity. The slide installs an identity that already exists on another line of life. Meditation is stillness. The slide is direction. Meditation is the pause. The slide is the shift. At its core, the slide is an energetic impression of a chosen reality delivered into the field when your mind is quiet enough to stop interfering. It is not built through effort because effort corrupts it. It is not shaped by desire because desire distorts it. It is received as a natural state, an inner knowing that this version of you is already real. When the slide lands, it feels less like creation and more like remembering. Chapter 7. The field responds only to the state, not the image. The most overlooked truth in manifestation is this: the field does not respond to what you see in your mind. It responds to who you are while seeing it. The image alone carries no power. Two people can hold the same mental picture, but only one of them transmits a frequency strong enough to alter their line of life. The difference is not in the picture. It is in the state behind it. Zeland repeats this without apology.
The image is a tool, but the state is the signal. The field reads coherence, not effort. It reads inner alignment, not visual detail. Neuroscience supports this with research on embodied cognition, showing that emotional and physiological states determine neuroplasticity far more than mental content. In simple terms, the brain changes when the body believes, not when the mind imagines. This is why many people think they are using a slide while nothing shifts. They focus on the image instead of the internal state that makes the image natural. They try to force emotion. They try to increase clarity. They try to intensify focus. But all this effort broadcasts internal contradiction. The body is tense, the breath is shallow, the nervous system is defensive. The field receives the contradiction, not the intention. A real slide feels different because the state beneath it is different. The inner posture shifts. The emotional tone softens. The body relaxes without instruction. The image feels lived, not constructed. This is what allows the slide to imprint. It enters the system as a memory, not as a performance. When this happens, the field recognizes the message because it carries authenticity, not longing. This distinction explains why some people collapse timelines rapidly, while others remain stuck for years. The field is blind to fantasy, but sensitive to conviction. It ignores imagination, but responds to identity. When the state aligns with the chosen reality, the image becomes a formality.
It is only a symbolic expression of something already accepted internally. This is the moment the shift begins, not when the picture is clear, but when the inner posture matches the reality the picture represents. Chapter 8. The time of day that opens the field the most. There are two moments in every day when the doorway into the field widens on its own. You don't create these openings, you enter them. They are built into your biology, and Zeland's teachings align perfectly with what neuroscience has proven and what Scripture has been describing for centuries. The first moment is the descent into sleep. This is the transition from wakefulness into the hypnagogic state when the brain is no longer guarding your identity with the same intensity. The prefrontal cortex relaxes, the limbic system quiets. The filters that normally reject new ideas become permeable. In this window, the slide slips through without resistance because the mind no longer protects the old version of you. This is not imagination, it is physiology. The field receives the message because the body is open enough to let it register. The second moment is the rise from sleep. The hypnopompic state is just as powerful, but it carries a risk many ignore. In this moment, the nervous system hasn't fully reactivated old patterns yet. Your emotional baseline is still soft, identity is still flexible. But because the ego wakes quickly, any anxious thought, any memory of yesterday, any expectation of stress can reclaim the system faster than you realize. This is why many spiritual traditions emphasize guarding the first thoughts of the morning, not for positivity, for purity of signal. Scripture echoes this. The watches of the night were not moments of prayer through willpower. They were the liminal spaces where the mind was quiet enough to hear what could not be heard while awake. Prophets received instruction in these intervals because the conscious mind was not drowning out the deeper signal. Zeland's slide operates by the same principle. Only the half-asleep mind can deliver the message clean. The most overlooked truth is this. The last impression before sleep becomes the blueprint the nervous system rehearses unconsciously. And the first impression upon waking becomes the emotional signature that sets the tone for the entire day. When these two impressions align with the slide, the shift accelerates. When they align with fear, doubt, or habit, the shift collapses. These windows happen every single day, and most people waste them without noticing. But once you recognize them, they become the most powerful tools you have. Chapter 9. The Law of Non-Effort. Zeland's entire framework rests on one principle. Reality shifts when you stop trying to shift it. Effort is the fracture. Effort is the signal of inner contradiction. When you want something intensely, you reveal that you do not believe it is already yours. The field responds to belief, not desire. This is why importance, craving, pressure, and urgency kill the slide before it forms. Jesus expressed the same mechanism in different language. Do not worry about tomorrow. This is not moral instruction, it is physics. Worry creates tension. Tension disrupts coherence. Coherence is the only state the field recognizes. When Jesus says to release the anxious mind, he is not telling you to become passive. He is teaching you how to remove the mental noise that blocks inner alignment.
The Bible's wisdom matches Zeland's equation. Remove effort and the path opens. Neuroscience supports this with studies on predictive processing. The brain cannot install a new identity while broadcasting a state of threat. Cortisol disrupts neuroplasticity. High arousal locks the system into survival patterns. You cannot shift to a new line of life while your biology is fighting for the old one. This is why the slide works only when the mind is quiet enough to let the nervous system soften. Softness is not weakness, it is permission. Letting go is not surrendering the desire, it is surrendering the resistance. When you stop trying to force the slide, the body stops contradicting you. The breath deepens, the chest opens, the muscles unclench. The identity you are installing begins to feel possible, then familiar, then natural. That naturalness is the point where the field finally receives the message without distortion. Non-effort is not passivity, it is precision. It is the removal of everything that interferes with the signal. When the desire no longer feels heavy, when the image stops feeling distant, when the body stops bracing for disappointment, you reach the exact frequency where the slide takes form. This is the secret every tradition, every mystic, every modern study keeps pointing toward. Reality responds not when you push, but when you align. Chapter 10. When the slide begins to alter reality. A real slide does not announce itself with fireworks. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a shift in atmospheric pressure that you feel before you understand. The first sign is subtle misalignment with your old timeline. Small things stop matching who you used to be. You notice that certain worries no longer trigger the same emotional charge. Situations that once demanded effort begin to resolve without you pushing. These early deviations are the first indicators that your internal state has changed enough for the external world to reorganize around it. Synchronicities appear with usual precision. They are not random coincidences, they are reflections. The field mirrors the new identity you installed during the slide with micro-adjustments. You hear conversations that confirm your new direction. Unexpected opportunities surface that align with the version of you that feels more real now. People treat you differently, not because they changed, but because your internal frequency no longer matches your previous pattern. Time itself behaves differently. You experience moments where events feel compressed, as if the path between intention and manifestation has shortened. Other times, certain problems fade as if dissolved from the timeline entirely. These distortions of time are not supernatural. They are the natural result of stepping into a line of life where the old problems were never part of your narrative. Then there is the unmistakable sensation of inner fullness. It arrives without ceremony. This fullness is the body signaling coherence. There is no craving, no urgency, no emotional spike. You simply feel aligned with a future that has already merged with the present. Neuroscience identifies this as limbic resolution, a reduction of inner conflict that stabilizes a new identity. Spiritually, it feels like peace. Physically, it feels like exhaling after holding your breath for years. As these shifts accumulate, the field responds with more force. Circumstances rearrange. Old obstacles dissolve. A path opens that previously felt inaccessible. What once required enormous effort becomes natural movement. This is the moment you realize the slide did not change the world, it changed the version of you experiencing the world, and reality adjusted accordingly. Chapter 11. The Biblical Architecture of the Miracle. Every major shift described in Scripture happens in the same kind of state Zeland points to. The quiet threshold where the conscious mind weakens and a deeper intelligence becomes available. When Samuel heard the divine call, he was lying down, not striving. His mind was softened by the edge of sleep. The noise of the day was gone. In this liminal space, his awareness could recognize what his waking mind had missed. The instruction did not come during effort, it came during surrender. Elias encountered the still small voice, a whisper that followed the storm, the wind, and the fire. The text makes the mechanism unmistakable. Revelation does not appear in noise. It appears only after noise collapses. This subtlety is the same subtlety that marks a true slide. It is not loud. It does not demand attention. It appears when everything unnecessary becomes silent. Every prophetic vision in the Old Testament shares this pattern. Revelation comes in dreams, trances, night watches, and moments when identity is most fluid. Jacob wrestles in the night. Daniel sees visions not in mental concentration, but in states where the veil between layers of consciousness thins. These are not supernatural interruptions. They are neurological windows identical to what modern science calls hypnagogic and hypnopompic transitions. When Paul describes the renewing of the inner man, he is speaking about identity shifting at a level that does not require conscious force. This is the same shift Zeland describes when the slide imprints. The old identity dissolves gently. The new identity settles as if it always belonged. There is no argument, no negotiation, no strain, only alignment. The biblical architecture of miracles rests on one principle. Transformation begins where the ego sleeps. Guidance, revelation, inner clarity, and identity shifts all emerge when consciousness is awake but the mind is not. Zeland's slide is simply a modern name for an ancient spiritual mechanism. The state that receives the slide is the same state in which prophets received instruction, kings received wisdom, and futures were rewritten. The miracle never came to the waking mind. It came to the open one. Chapter 12. The three types of slide. Not all slides operate the same way. They carry different signatures, different movements, different effects on the field. Zeland never classified them explicitly, but the mechanics within his teachings allow for a deeper understanding. When you look through the lens of consciousness, neurophysiology, and biblical symbolism, three distinct categories emerge. Each one shifts reality in a different manner, and each one appears only when the mind is silent enough for identity to reorganize. The first is the slide of substitution. This is the clean replacement of an inner narrative. You do not construct a new image, you step into it. The old sense of self loses weight, and a new version settles into place with surprising familiarity. It feels like remembering a truth rather than imagining a possibility. The substitution slide works best for identity-level changes, confidence, purpose, emotional stability, inner certainty. You know it has anchored because the previous version of you feels foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. The second is the slide of immersion. This one does not replace a narrative, it absorbs you into an entirely new reality. Instead of seeing an image, you find yourself inside it. The sensory texture changes, the emotional tone shifts. The environment feels present, almost tactile, even though your body remains where it is. Neuroscience calls this state immersive simulation, where the brain temporarily suspends its attachment to the external world and merges with an inner construct. Spiritually, this mirrors the prophetic visions described in Scripture, where individuals stepped into scenes that felt more real than waking life. This slide is most effective for large-scale shifts, major opportunities, new timelines, parallel paths. The third slide is the slide of observe and slip. This slide is the most subtle and often the most powerful. You do not replace anything. You do not immerse into anything. You simply observe an impression without touching it, without forcing meaning, without trying to merge with it. The slide drifts across your awareness, and your consciousness slips into alignment with it almost by resonance. This is the state mystics call effortless union. It is a quiet merging. You know this slide has taken hold when a sense of inevitability replaces desire. The shift feels done, not because you worked for it, but because you drifted into it. These three slides are not techniques, they are movements of consciousness. They cannot be forced because force collapses them. They emerge naturally when the mind is silent enough, the emotional field is calm enough, and the identity is soft enough to receive a new configuration. Each one has its own way of touching the field.
Each one leads you to a different dimension of the same truth. You never create these slides, you meet them. Chapter 13. The fatal error, trying to use the slide while awake. The most common mistake is also the most invisible. People try to activate the slide while fully awake, fully alert, and fully identified with the ego. They sit upright, focusing intensely, thinking that clarity and effort will force the shift. But the awake mind is the exact state where the slide cannot form. The ego is too loud, the nervous system is too guarded, the internal signal is too contaminated with fear, doubt, and habit. When you are awake, the mind is a gatekeeper. It filters everything through logic, memory, and protection. It compares the slide with your current life and rejects it as unrealistic. It tries to control the image. It questions the feeling. It interprets instead of receiving. The field cannot read the slide delivered from this place because the signal is fractured. You send desire layered with anxiety, intention layered with disbelief, hope layered with tension. The message collapses before it leaves your system. Trying harder makes it worse.
The more effort you apply, the more your body enters a state of threat. Shoulders tighten, breath shortens, the chest constricts. This is physiological resistance. The nervous system cannot accept a new identity while preparing to defend the old one. Neuroscience calls this limbic override, where emotional survival patterns overpower cognitive intention. Spiritually, it mirrors the biblical principle of divided mind, double-mindedness, where no request can take root. Zeland's warning is simple but absolute. The slide is not an active process, it is a receptive one. When you try to use the slide while awake, you are not entering a new timeline, you are strengthening the old one. You reinforce the identity that is trying to manifest, not the one that has already shifted. The ego becomes the creator, and the ego cannot create. The slide only becomes accessible when the mind is soft enough to stop interfering, when thinking slows, when tension dissolves, when awareness becomes gentle rather than sharp. In this liminal softness, the ego steps aside and consciousness steps forward. Trying to use the slide while awake is like trying to hear a whisper while standing next to a jet engine. Silence is required. Surrender is required. The mind must sleep so the creator can wake. Chapter 14. How to recognize your ego trying to take back control. The moment the slide begins to work, the ego reacts. It cannot tolerate a shift it did not authorize. It senses the loss of control long before you consciously notice change. Its first move is subtle, a slight tension in the chest, a small doubt disguised as logic, a faint whisper of, "Be realistic." These micro-signals are not random. They are the ego anchoring you back into the identity you are outgrowing. The ego's resistance appears as emotional echoes. Old fears rise without context. Thoughts you thought you had outgrown resurface with surprising strength. The ego is not trying to sabotage you out of malice. It is trying to keep the familiar alive. Its job is survival, not evolution. The slide threatens its territory because the slide shifts identity without its permission. So it attempts to reassert itself through the only tools it has: fear, logic, memory, and tension. There is also the narrative recoil. The ego starts telling stories that contradict the new state. It rehearses obstacles. It predicts disappointment. It searches for evidence that the shift is impossible. Neuroscience maps this to predictive coding. The brain clings to old patterns because updating identity requires energy, vulnerability, and neuroreconfiguration. The ego interprets this as danger, so it pushes back with urgency. Another sign is the sudden urge to act prematurely. When the ego feels threatened, it pushes you to fix, control, or make something happen. It draws you back into effort because effort anchors you in the old timeline. Effort is familiar. Effort feels safe. Effort gives the ego the illusion of control. But effort destroys the state that allows the slide to imprint. There is also self-correction. The ego tries to improve the slide, adding more detail, more emotion, more intensity. This destroys the naturalness of the impression. The slide becomes stiff, artificial, overworked. Naturalness disappears, and with it, the shift. And finally, there is the emotional contraction. After a moment of clarity or alignment, you feel a sudden tightening, as if you've stepped out of the state. This contraction is the ego's last attempt to reclaim dominance. Recognizing it is crucial. You don't fight it. You don't argue with it. You don't chase the state. You simply notice the contraction without obeying it. The ego collapses when ignored. The slide strengthens when not tampered with. Understanding these signals is the key to staying aligned. The ego does not vanish. It quiets when the new identity becomes stable enough to stop threatening it. You don't defeat the ego, you outgrow it. Chapter 15. The final practice, the semi-sleep ritual of the slide. This ritual is not a technique, it is a doorway. It works because it uses the one state where your biology, your consciousness, and the field all become receptive at the same time. The goal is simple. Bring the body to the edge of sleep while keeping awareness awake enough to receive the slide. When done correctly, the shift happens without strain, without imagination, without emotional intensity. It happens because the resistance that normally blocks change is no longer present. You begin with the body, not through intentional relaxation, but through allowing heaviness. Let the muscles loosen on their own. Notice the weight settling into the mattress or the chair. The point is not to relax, but to stop holding tension. The moment the body feels slightly heavier than usual, you are entering the pre-sleep descent where the mind begins to lose dominance.
Then comes the softening of attention. Let your awareness drift outward, not toward an object, not toward a thought, just outward, as if the edges of your perception expand. This widening of attention reduces prefrontal activity and prepares the brain for the alpha-theta transition. The ego becomes quiet in this widening. It cannot maintain its narrative when attention stops gripping the world tightly. Next is the induction into hypnagogia. You do not try to enter it, you let it arrive. Flickers of images appear and disappear. Sensations become less precise, thoughts become less linear. This is the neurological boundary where the slide can finally anchor. You remain aware without interfering. You are not trying to steer anything. You are waiting for the opening. When the mind is quiet enough, the slide emerges. It does not feel like visualization. It feels like an impression rising from somewhere deeper, a memory from a future line of life, an image or scene that holds a naturalness impossible to fake. You do not hold it. You do not force clarity. You do not add emotion. You let it rest in your awareness the way a feather rests on still air. This is the moment to deliver the silent phrase. One sentence only. Short, factual, calm. It is not an affirmation. It is a recognition, a statement of identity that fits the slide. You say it inwardly once with no intention of persuasion. If the phrase lands, you will feel a shift in the body, a settling, a quiet internal yes. This is the sign that the slide has imprinted. Then comes the release. The moment the slide feels natural, you let it go. Not dismissively, not anxiously, not with urgency. You release it the way you release a breath. The new identity settles into the nervous system without argument. The slide completes itself only when you stop touching it. The final test of authenticity is simple. After the slide dissolves, you feel a calm familiarity. Not excitement, not hope, familiarity. As if the version of you in that slide is not ahead of you, but already within you.
If that feeling is present, the shift has begun. If not, you don't repeat the ritual. You wait for the next night, for the next window, for the next moment the mind softens enough to receive what the awake mind keeps rejecting. The seal that anchors the shift. Before this experience closes, there is one action that strengthens the very state you've been exploring. Words shape attention. Attention shapes identity. And identity shapes the line of life you step into next. Comment with the phrase, "When the mind sleeps, the creator wakes." Write it not as participation, but as recognition, as acknowledgement, as a quiet internal agreement with the mechanism you just learned. This phrase reinforces the principle at the heart of Zeland's teaching and aligns your attention with the state that allows the slide to imprint. Use it as a seal, an imprint of your own, anchoring the shift you are stepping into. The other side of the portal. Everything you have learned leads to a single realization. The slide is not a technique. It is a doorway that only opens when the ego becomes quiet enough for consciousness to speak. The awake mind tries to build reality through effort, pressure, visualization, and emotion. But effort is resistance. Pressure is fear. Visualization is performance. Emotion is instability. None of these can shift a timeline because all of them come from the level of self that has no creative authority. The real power appears when the mind falls asleep, when the inner noise dissolves, when the body releases its grip, when identity becomes fluid. This is the moment where the deeper intelligence awakens, the intelligence that Scripture calls the inner man, that neuroscience calls the subconscious integrator, and that Zeland describes as the level of being that interacts directly with the field. It is here, in this liminal space, that the slide imprints without distortion. You have seen how every tradition points to the same truth. The prophets heard in the night. Wisdom arrived in stillness. Revelation came in the quiet. Science shows that the brain becomes most malleable in the transition between wake and sleep. And Zeland reveals that this is the state where intention stops being effort and becomes nature. When the slide merges with identity, reality no longer resists, it responds. If you practice this with sincerity, calmness, and precision, your life will not remain the same. You will move from forcing outcomes to inhabiting them, from craving to receiving, from hoping to recognizing. The slide is the bridge between who you have been and who you already are on another line of life. When the mind sleeps, the creator wakes. And once the creator wakes, the world shifts to match.